Welcome to Tony Tremble. Today we take a deep dive into love, lust, envy, and revenge. Brutality. Brutality. That's a term we often use to describe human behavior when it comes closer to our most primitive instincts. That's the word Detective Grace Grisham used in her report to describe the horrendous scenario she chanced upon. The entire community was shocked as the tidal wave of macabre news flooded the streets. It was the gossip of every business, household, and rendezvous. The collective dreams of a thriving, bustling small town were shattered and torn apart by the events that took place on the early evening of July 16th, 2023. The aftermath of those events included Mark Jaku, a respected businessman and the owner of an uncanny charisma, being apprehended in his workplace in front of colleagues and co-workers under the charge of first-degree murder. The once king of prom had descended to the deepest of hells and was going to face justice for what he had done. Mark was born in an industrial district right outside Detroit. He had been the pride and joy of his family since birth. A gifted athlete and an avid entrepreneur, his teenage years went by in the blink of an eye, finding Mark at the top of his student body. His sense of humor was contagious, and his pale skin would go bright red with laughter that could fill any room. Everywhere Mark went, people inevitably followed. He was a natural-born leader and wasn't shy of using his superpower whenever he saw a chance. Although he wasn't the brightest in the class, he managed to secure a sports scholarship at a prestigious university. He studied hard and played even harder. His skills at basketball granted him a tryout for the Detroit Pistons, and he was just a stone's throw away from entering the NBA as a professional basketball player. The rejection, according to fellow student and friend Zoe Gilligan, hit Mark, a natural winner, like a physical blow. According to Gilligan, he spent months trying to recover from it and had a hard time getting back on the basketball pitch. That same year, Randolph Martin Jaku, Mark's dad, suddenly passed away. He was running one fine Tuesday morning in a nearby forest when he fell onto the pavement. His lifeless body was found by a lost cyclist who called 911. Mark fell into a spiral of depression and hopelessness. He turned into a taciturn young man. He chose to isolate himself from colleagues and peers and ended up hurting himself. He inflicted physical pain on his body so he could forget his emotional pain. When found by his mother, Lillian Kimberlin, in the bathroom surrounded by a pool of his own blood and crying, she decided it was too much for her to handle. She committed Mark to an institution for 6 months. At the conclusion, he was declared sane and capable of socializing again after treating his depression. Suicidal thoughts slowly disappeared from his mind. He went back to college and graduated as an accountant, but couldn't go back to Detroit. He was afraid of the memories of his happy childhood and that they would bring back the cape of depression that he'd fought so hard to leave behind. He had struggled greatly to climb out of that hole of self-pity and violence, and he didn't want anything to do with it, ever again. Whenever he felt nervous or agitated, the fear of falling into the dark abyss of loss and mental instability became enough to push him back into the prefabricated, tight, and tidy reality he had put together for himself. Besides, although he had been born in one, he never really enjoyed the busy life of a big city. As soon as he could, Mark fled to Lafayette, Indiana, a new place to start fresh. Somewhere, nobody knew of his breakdown, his family, his shattered dreams, or his broken hopes. Upon arrival, he started working for a shoe manufacturer. This was a family endeavor, the dream of a lifetime of its owner, a French immigrant named Jules Benoit. He ran the business helped by his family. Among them was Alice Benoit, his eldest daughter. Mark and Alice didn't notice each other at first, but because of an unforeseen incident, their paths and their fates became intertwined. Little did they know that tragedy was around the block, and that the very bond that held them together was going to be the motive that would push the life of someone so close towards oblivion. Alice Benoit, a distinguished student, had excelled at everything her father had ever asked her to do. Jules Benoit had the highest standards for his business and his own performance. His obsessive perfectionism proved to be his vantage point against all competition. As for her daughter, though, Jules' incessant claims for her to perform better and do more dug a hole in Alice's self-esteem. She struggled with addictions growing up and had used substances to avoid reality for as long as she could remember. Despite her seemingly destructive behavior, Alice didn't have any problems being the top student in her class. The whole community of Lafayette thought she had a bright future ahead. Jules' face would lighten up with an undoubted expression of pride whenever her achievements were brought up by friends, peers, or coworkers. Nevertheless, a time bomb of resentment and hate was ticking away inside Alice's heart as she blossomed into her youth. A trained kinesiologist, she would often be at the footwear factory to help her dad and the R&D team create better, more comfortable sneakers. She would always leave exhausted and smiling. The little girl inside of her still smiled at her dad's approval, something she had been seeking all her life but could never attain. She wanted to be seen, to be told she was good enough. Next to that smiling girl was another one, full of rage and resentment. Her dad always wanted more. Society wanted more, and she was tired of playing Miss Perfect. Her main occupation was working in her private consultation. She felt that helping injured people served as her therapy. It was finally a world in which her dad had nothing to say about her performance. She was free when she was with her patients, and they seemed to love her back. Alice Benoit and Marc Jécu were trapped inside the elevator when in the factory together one day. She had always been a beautiful woman. Her piercing, yet warm blue eyes and the universe of freckles surrounding them were enough to pierce through Marc's initial barrier. He had been advised by his psychiatrist to start dating, and his eyes were lost forever in the galaxy of light and deep blue looking back at him from the other side of the elevator. Alice, on the other side of the stalled apparatus, saw the cracks and flaws in Marc right away, yet fell in love immediately with his smile and his athletic body. She also found in Marc someone who was so deeply flawed he could never be a judge of who she was. She had finally met a man who wasn't like his dad, a perfectionist lost in his obsession. They spoke for those 2 hours, and the giggles, common ground, and physical attraction materialized just a month later. Text messages, random calls, and a few dates were enough for them to be inevitably, completely, and fatally lost in each other. To the eyes of the world, the newcomer, the handsome accountant of the town's biggest factory, was dating the most promising young girl in the city. They were seen with envy by those who spent time with the couple. Their romance was so intense they got married just half a year later and moved into a new house to start their new path as a family. It was out of a fairy tale, an idyllic setting ready for miracles to occur. But the miracle they were seeking did not take place. Although they tried for the following 3 years, they couldn't conceive. Alice went through numerous treatments, and they ran all kinds of tests on both. The concluding evidence was appalling. They were both perfectly fertile. Although they had good news when getting the test results, the usual doctor jokes were not funny anymore. "Doesn't hurt to keep trying, right?" said the professionals before greeting them with a handshake. Marc was feeling a mix of sadness, frustration, anger, and disappointment he couldn't bear. He started feeling the silent but deadly whispers of his long-gone depression crawling up his ears in the morning. That feeling was a memory he wanted to erase at all costs. Alice, on her side, felt the void in her chest grow wider, and the old familiar feeling of not being good enough become an automatic thought haunting her. Just like it happened with her dad, she felt the obligation to excel. She didn't want to be a mom. She wanted to be the best mom in the history of moms. Alice struggled to stay clean, far from drugs, throwing herself at work to avoid evading reality. Years went by in this scenario, and the couple started to become further apart. They stopped practicing for the baby's conception, and their household, once filled with love and laughter, became silent, dark, and hostile. Both Marc and Alice were reviving their old wounds from their teenage and early youth days and going through their personal hells again. In the middle of that storm, Marc was presented with Susan Risson, a young assistant who was attending college to become an accountant, and to join Marc in running the factory's finances. Susan was Alice's half-sister. She was the fruit of Jules' second wife and had been living with her on campus most of her life. Susan grew up in a house full of luxury and in high social status in small Lafayette. Behind the appearance of the caring, naive, and shy little sister, Susan always felt envy for Alice and wanted the kind of happiness her sister seemed to have. To Susan's eyes, Jules' demands and expectations for Alice were an act of love that put her at the forefront of the stage in the Benoit family. Little did Susan know of the struggles, the resentment, and the hatred her sister felt toward that never-ending set of expectations her dad had for her. So the moment she set foot in the office and sat at her desk next to Mark's, she knew she had been awarded a golden opportunity to turn it all around. She wanted to debunk the star of the Benoit show and stand proudly in the front of the stage. She wanted all lights on her. None of the three involved knew that the stage set wasn't for comedy, but for the most horrendous tragedy. The triangle would ultimately lead to a bloodbath that would shock the entire community and unveil the human miseries even the most perfect families hide behind their smiles. Susan was flirtatious from day one. She knew what she wanted, and she was ready to get it. Being a beautiful young woman with vertiginous curves and an infectious smile had granted her the love of many men in the past. She had left a myriad of broken hearts wherever she went. She didn't want any of them. She wanted what Alice had, just like it happened their entire life. The sisters had lived together for almost a decade, and Alice witnessed how Susan went from a toddler to a young girl. By then, she had turned from that girl into a beautiful woman. Alice had always had the kind of affection you'd have for a child, rather than a sister for Susan. Alice represented the law and had often taken care of Susan, while Jules and Andrea, his second wife, were traveling for months at a time. Their bond was strong, but they weren't peers. Alice had never trusted any of her secrets to her little sister. In fact, she still saw her that way. According to Macy Grant, a next-door neighbor and friend of Benoit's, Alice and Susan never fought as young girls. It was more like a mother-daughter relationship. Whatever Alice said or did, Susan would imitate and obey right away. For Alice, the arrival of her little sister back into her life was a way to fill a hole her failed attempts at maternity had left in her. She saw in Susan the possibility of reconnecting with that old feeling. She would often invite her to their house and give her nice presents, drive her around town, and treat her like the daughter she dreamed of but couldn't conceive. But Susan had other plans, very different from Alice's. She wanted what she had. She wanted the house, the husband, and the dreams. One cold, late evening in January of 2023, Mark and Susan had to stay late organizing some urgent paperwork Jules needed to present to the IRS. The factory was empty, and the only people left in the entire building were the two of them. Susan saw this as the opportunity to finally make a move on Mark. They had been exchanging looks, jokes, and complicity for over a year, and the sexual tension between them was at its pinnacle. Mark, a failed NBA athlete and father, had devoted more time than ever before to his training and was in awesome shape for a man of his age. Plus, the little spots of gray hair and tight office clothes gave him a handsome flair Susan found captivating. Susan had been dressing up to go to work, buying fancy lingerie to wear underneath her see-through blouses, and would often wear short, tight skirts to work. That night, she sat on Mark's desk, crossed her legs, and told her sister's husband she wanted him. She was direct, to the point, decided, and went straight to the action. Despite Mark's initial refusal, the touch of Susan's soft skin on his hand and chest was the caress that Alice hadn't given him in months, or even years. Mark and Alice didn't have what you would call a sex life anymore. Everything was strained by their inability to procreate. Sex had gone from a need to a bad memory for the couple. Susan brought Mark towards her half-open blouse and buried his face between her breasts. Then, lifting his head to kiss him on the lips with the right amount of wilderness to excite him and not scare him away. "We shouldn't do this. You know it's wrong," Mark managed to say before responding to Susan's second kiss. Suddenly, years of frustration and bad memories were unleashed. The dam Mark had built to contain his desires and needs cracked, and a savage craving took over the entire office as their bodies clashed with each other. That scene marked the beginning of the end. The narrative of their lives would be changed forever after. Although nobody could foresee the devastating consequences of a single night of pleasure, the aftermath of that clash of bodies became the doom of the ethereal love triangle forming inside the Benoit factory. The initial encounter was followed by a wave of sorrow and guilt. Mark became the most attentive and caring husband Alice could ever have wanted. Little did she know that the fire that lit that morning smile and the countless love gestures was guilt and sorrow. Although they still didn't connect intimately, Mark became a source of light for Alice's broken dreams. He was the one golden thread she would hold on to stay sane, working, and thriving. Her obsessive thoughts about not being enough would wind down as soon as Mark was around. He reassured her that love was a possibility and that their love was genuine, but it was all a facade. Susan and Mark continued to have encounters in and out of the factory. They even went as far as being intimate inside Alice and Mark's house whenever the wife wasn't around. The close calls, the excitement, the adrenaline, and the feeling of tasting the forbidden fruit made them take increasingly higher risks. Both confused lust and the spark of clandestine relationship with true love, and Susan began the second stage of her plan, talking to Mark about forming their own family, displacing Alice, erasing her from the picture. Mark, hesitant at first, became enamored of Susan's powerful initiative and endless will to throw herself into his arms on every occasion. Her words sounded real. For a moment, Mark could foresee happiness in his future with Susan. Yet every time he went back home to find Alice's broken smile and loneliness, his heart would shrink and ache. His marriage was falling apart, and both knew it. Mark's honeymoon period faded away, and he was more distant than he had ever been before, spending countless hours in the office and traveling around to meet with different providers and clients. Alice became the head of the kinesiologist division in the local hospital and published her research on foot anatomy in the shape of a book that gave her nationwide recognition. Despite her academic success, she was still living a silent hell inside a home with a distant husband. No achievement could fill the gap not being good enough had created in Alice's deepest thoughts and feelings. In the middle of the storm was Susan, the woman who wanted it all and wouldn't take no for an answer. Together, Mark and Susan started knitting a dark spiderweb that was suffocating Alice little by little. Her sister was left alone, binge-watching Netflix series and eating cheap ice cream on the couch while Susan and Mark enjoyed the fire of their newfound passion elsewhere. But Susan wanted more. She didn't want to share Mark with her sister anymore. She wanted her out of the picture. She began pushing more and more for Mark to leave her sister behind and form a new family with her. Lines like, "We can be happy together. I can give you the kind of family she could never form with you. And your marriage with Alice is a joke. You deserve better," became a constant drilling on Mark's ears, piercing his brain, forcing him to act and do something he didn't want to. On Monday morning, 5 months into their affair, Mark woke up and moved over to hug the person on the other side of the bed. In his sleepy confusion, he whispered, "I love you, Susan," into Alice's ears. His wife jumped out of bed and burst into tears. "What did you say? Mark, what did you call me?" Mark was embarrassed. He felt as if his unconscious thinking had betrayed him. He swore it was a mistake, but it was too late. The seed of suspicion was planted, and it would grow into a huge tree capable of casting a shadow over their family. Alice became aware of the little things between Mark and Susan. She noticed the small gestures, the shared hours, and the dirty looks. Her little sister always wore the sexiest clothes, the tightest outfits, and the most revealing see-through blouses whenever she met them. Alice became paranoid and started showing up at odd times at the factory, or getting back home earlier. Her fantasy of not being good enough had just grown to a new level. Her love life, her dreams, and the home she had worked so hard to build were being threatened. Susan became her enemy. Their bond was broken. Phone calls, gifts, and invitations to go out became non-existent. Finally, Alice decided she wanted to clear her mind about what was going on between her little sister and her distant husband and confronted both. They denied the whole thing, laughing at Alice's insinuations and telling her it was crazy to think of something like that. Yet, Susan and Mark knew Alice's suspicions were getting close to the truth. Their encounters became riskier and thus more exciting. On one hand, reality was closing its grip on their apocryphal love, and on the other, it was reigniting their fire. What they didn't know was that the new flame of passion would burn away their dreams and terminate the life of one of the three people involved in the crooked, twisted love affair. It was Alice who bribed the security personnel of the factory to leave the room and allow her to search for camera footage until she found it. The scene was almost too much for her. The lips of her husband were going over the young body of her little sister. Susan returned his lustful moves with passion. Their frantic moves, the kisses, the desire. It was like watching a monochrome nightmare. But that wasn't all. Their tender hug after the action was one of the things that enraged Alice the most. "They're in love," she exclaimed inside the empty room. She drove home, deciding to confront Mark about it. She wasn't going to be second to anyone, especially her sister. Alice was in a state of shock and drove like a madwoman. Inside Alice and Mark's house, Susan was waiting for Mark to meet her. She had big news to tell him. Her period was late. She had bought a pregnancy test and was ready to do it with him as soon as he arrived. When she heard the front door opening, she rushed down the stairs to meet Mark but was baffled when she saw Alice instead. The blue eyes on her sister's face, the ones that had always been welcoming and warm to her, were full of rage and fire. Alice stood in the living room and screamed, You want to have what I have just like you did all your life. I trusted you, Susan. I opened the doors of my home, of my heart to you. This is how you pay me back? This is how you repay me? Fucking my husband in Dad's factory? Alice's eyes moved down, and she noticed the pregnancy test in Susan's hand. That was the moment she lost it completely. She was enraged beyond reason and threw herself over her sister. Susan ran upstairs, but Alice caught her feet, and she tripped and fell rolling down until she hit the bottom with her head. She lay there, motionless, with her eyes blank, looking up at the ceiling in a pool of blood. Alice, shocked, fell on her knees, unable to do anything, paralyzed by a mix of guilt and fear. She knew she had just killed her little sister. As soon as Mark arrived at the house, he witnessed with horror his newfound love dead at the bottom of the stairs, holding a pregnancy test in her hand. The look on Alice's face was even scarier than reality. She seemed gone, completely gone, as if she had drifted away. Mark's first instinct was to hug his wife and whisper he was sorry into her ears. Alice burst into tears and so did Mark. They held each other for half an hour before deciding to dispose of Susan's corpse in the most horrendous way possible. Using Alice's knowledge, they put the body in various bags and hid it in factory grounds. Mark buried Susan piece by piece in different places, thinking they could hide the homicide, but the burden was too big to carry. News of her disappearance made it to the local authorities, and the case got nationwide coverage. The police interrogated everyone close to Susan, but couldn't pierce through Mark and Alice's perfect alibi. They told the police about a supposed romance between Susan and a factory client in Washington, making up a perfectly knit story of an anonymous lover. For a few weeks, that deflected police attention and moved their search attempts to a different state. But the leads were scarce and the whole investigation was stalled. The little community of Lafayette was shocked by the news. Susan was perceived as the perfect daughter, the last jewel of the Benoit crown, an ideal member of their society. Weeks became months, and just when the case was about to go cold, Detective Grace Grisham, a veteran of the force known for her sharp intellect and ability to solve cold cases, was called. Meanwhile, Alice's and Mark's behavior became erratic. The ghost of Susan haunted their house and their lives. Mark couldn't help but listen to Susan's giggle and see her on the desk next to his every day. Alice, on the other hand, saw flashes of young Susan whenever she closed her eyes. Her sister's illuminated smile was a cause of despair most of the time. She found it hard to breathe whenever that happened. The guilt that hung heavy from them mixed with their earlier conditions became an explosive combination threatening to unveil their horrendous secret. Detective Grisham called them for testimony and found something odd in the way they repeated almost exactly the statement they gave the initial investigators. It was as if they were reciting a script they had learned to perfection. That ignited her suspicion, and she decided to go deeper into their bond, their history, and their lives. Also, she interviewed everyone in Washington, discarding anything in that city. Instead, what she did was request camera footage inside the factory before Susan's disappearance. The scenes between Susan and Mark shed light on the love triangle that had formed between them. Alice knew about Detective Grisham and the footage because she was alerted by the security personnel. The same she had bribed to get access to the images Detective Grisham saw. They had kept Mark and Susan's secret for months. It didn't say anything about Alice's requests to the detective either. With this new information, Detective Grisham called them again to testify separately, in contiguous rooms at the police station. She made piercing questions about the romance, and although they confirmed it, that wasn't enough proof to put anyone behind bars. The case breakout came when Detective Grisham asked for the perimetral cameras on factory grounds. With those, she could clearly see Mark burying black plastic bags scattered around on the premises in the days following Susan's disappearance. When they unearthed the pieces of Susan's body, they had enough evidence to charge Mark J. Koo with first-degree murder. Knowing his rights, he pleaded guilty, but refused to testify before the trial. Lafayette was a town in a state of shock. Jules Benoit had to be taken to an ICU because he had a stroke as soon as he knew about Mark and Susan in the murder. Lillian Kimberlin, Mark's mom, flew in for the trial and was stormed with questions by news reporters from the entire country. The case became a nationwide scandal. The day of the trial arrived, and Alice was called upon the stand to testify. She was still a beautiful woman, but there was something deeply flawed and broken about her piercing blue eyes. Alice tried keeping it together and managed to withstand the questioning without breaking her facade. She claimed to know nothing about the murder of her husband's dismembering and consequent burying of her sister's body. She cried for the cameras and all, but didn't break her alibi at any moment. It was Mark who did it. The first thing he said as he took the stand was, "I didn't kill Susan Risson." The whole courtroom went silent, and the prosecutor's strategy was destroyed. The case took a wild spin, and Mark burst into tears in front of the jury. The judge called upon a recess. The lawyers on both sides were completely puzzled. If it wasn't Mark, then who did it? Suddenly it dawned on Detective Grisham that it required Alice's knowledge of the human body for the perfect dismembering of the corpse. She went to the prosecutor's office, and together they assembled a questioning strategy to pierce through Alice's defensive statements. It wasn't necessary. As soon as she was called to the stand and asked about the events, emphasizing the body's mutilation with photographs, she broke down and told the jury, the judge, and prosecutor that it was her who had killed her sister. She told them all about the accident, the pregnancy test, and her frustrations. She was found guilty of first-degree murder, which granted her the sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Mark, he was accused of obstructing justice, hiding information, and false testimony, as well as dismembering a human body. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The thriving community of Lafayette became a shattered ghost town. The lives of its most illustrious citizens became a nationwide newspaper cover unveiling the dark plot formed underneath their seemingly perfect narrative. Their dreams were gone, and the bustling town became a mere carcass of what it was. What remained and will linger on for years is the awareness of what humans are capable of when assaulted by their childish fears and cornered by treason. Alice Benoit became an example of how pushing too hard to become the perfect woman could ultimately lead to the most gruesome ending.